Well, it's happening. It would seem that we are reaching a wall of sorts with AI model training. Diminishing returns are starting to show, at least according to reports, and foundation models simply are not reaching the levels of intelligence that we would expect based on the proposed exponential curve that some AGI lab investors and proponents would like you to believe in. So it's important to consider this because even if it's not happening now, I think anybody thinking with a critical hat on is open to the idea that at some point we're going to hit a wall if we haven't gotten there already. And there is some important evidence that we have already gotten there. First of all, we all know the high-profile cases, Ilya Sutskever leaving OpenAI, but other key researchers as well are leaving these big companies, either to start their own independent research or, going somewhere better. And I think it's important to consider that this is probably in part due to office politics and what have you. However, it's also not what you would expect if OpenAI, for example, was on the brink of AGI in 2025. It's not to say that you wouldn't expect anybody to leave, but the key players probably wouldn't be leaving in what seems like droves if there was the potential for AGI in 2025 or really anytime soon. If they were seeing significant progress, they would probably be much more willing to stay there and much more excited. But instead, we're seeing figures like Ilya Sutskever saying things like, we're starting to hit a wall, and now it's not time to scale, it's time to research more and enter a new era of discovery. And for some, that's exciting, and for others, that's a little bit dreadful because they kind of assumed that there would be an exponential curve towards AGI in the next few years, but it's turning out that that's probably not the case. We are seeing the emergence of new scaling laws, and that's what Microsoft's CEO is saying. This is somebody who's extremely financially tied to the success and the excitement of these models, but is saying there is a little bit of a change coming along. And the change is significant. It's test time compute, essentially. And test time compute is important to consider. Essentially, models like O1, which instead of focusing the compute on the training and building the foundational core, instead they're focusing on the inference side of things, the inference stage, which is a little bit more economically efficient and can produce some pretty good results. However, critics would say that it's a little bit difficult to distinguish this from just fancy prompting or a little bit lower level prompting. And that's not to say that it's not an important direction to head in, but it also comes with its downsides, and it isn't necessarily an iteration on the underlying language model as much as an iteration on the way that it is being used. And so it's important to consider this. And what's essentially happening here is that GPT-4 came out in, I believe it was 2023, early 2023 or something like that. And since then, other models have started to build up in performance towards GPT-4 and just haven't really gotten better than GPT-4. And what we're hearing out of OpenAI through anonymous sources, so how much can you actually trust those, is that GPT-5, codenamed Orion within the company, simply isn't as good as they were expecting. And so basically, there is some evidence, and even if you don't believe that diminishing returns have hit yet, and there is probably potential for iteration on these new methods like O1, the reality is that at some point we are going to hit diminishing returns, and there's a good chance that it's happening right now, especially on the foundational level. So, now what? We've all been talking about AI for a long time now, and if you're anything like me, you've been playing with ChatGPT since it first came out, and it's a lot of fun, and it's integrated itself into your workflow to some degree. You use it a lot, and it's a great app. It has all these cool features, and they're adding new features all the time. And so, to some degree, for consumers, it is actually very useful. But how far can that actually go, and what does this mean for the future of the industry? Well, I think it means a few things, and to start, I think it means a focus on integration. Let's just take as an assumption the fact that models, the underlying models, like GPT-4, like Cloud, like Gemini, aren't going to get much better. Let's just take that to be a fact, even though obviously that is a controversial assertion and may not be true. They don't necessarily need to get better. The reason is because they're already pretty good. We've been seeing more and more products start to try integrating these language models in various ways. There are obviously many different ways that this happens. One is just a standard chatbot. How many apps do you open now and there's a little chatbot button in the bottom right corner, and it's basically just some sort of GPT wrapper with some special data fed to it and some buttons. Those kinds of integrations are pretty surface level, and I would say pretty simple, and what you would expect to find at this stage in this technology's life cycle. But that is nowhere near what we will probably be seeing in the coming years. Integrations are going to be huge. And when we're looking into where we're actually going to see these models integrated, not only is approach important, but also understanding even where our focus should be. Because frankly, language models might be pretty good so far, and they might get better as well, but there are just some things that you probably shouldn't use them for. And they're fairly obvious, but at the same time, it's worth kind of having some clarity in terms of where we should be applying our efforts in building with language models coming up in the next decade. First, when you're considering an integration of a language model, it's worth considering the requirement of accuracy for the task or the feature that you are trying to build. Obviously, something like an important medical decision or an operation of a heavy machine or a big investment or weapons systems are extremely high in terms of requirement of accuracy. Requirement of accuracy is a key metric to consider when evaluating whether or not an LLM should be applied to a specific domain or a specific feature integration or a specific application or a specific business altogether. And this applies in sort of a broad way, because while you might not think that your math homework matters that much, if an LLM does your math homework and it's just wrong about everything, then the math homework is kind of useless and you're going to get a bad grade, or you're just going to have to do it yourself. And I'm not advocating that anybody cheat on their math homework, but to illustrate the idea, it's not just this is a task which has really high stakes if it fails, like a medical decision, but it's also this is a task that if the LLM isn't accurate, then it's kind of just useless. Because if an LLM is going to do math, then it needs to be accurate, otherwise your math is going to be wrong, and it's not actually going to end up being useful. And this applies to engineering, this applies to building out software, this applies to business altogether. And so it's really important to remember that language models and other generative AI products as well are simply not that accurate, and they're always going to have these accuracy limitations, especially when we consider the near future. And so it's very important to consider the requirement of accuracy. Some things like, content creation and project initialization for, say, a new React app, if you're doing software development, are relatively low stakes, and there isn't a huge requirement of accuracy. Plus, you can expect that the LLM will actually be fairly accurate in those areas. If you put out a new blog post, for example, the requirement of accuracy depends on several factors. However, as a general rule, nobody's going to die because you didn't have an accurate fact in your blog post or because your blog post wasn't very interesting. So it's important to consider the requirement of accuracy, but that doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of different tasks that you can still do with LLMs accurately and that they can't still be applied for. It's also worth considering that there's a lot of gray area with these, and you'll have to take it on a task by task basis, but I would strongly recommend considering the requirement of accuracy when evaluating an integration of a language model or other form of generative AI into a product. The next metric which is important to consider is the complexity. And if you consider something like answering a question, there's really only one step to that, and the complexity, while technically high, is relatively low when you consider the range of things that you can technically apply an LLM to. So, for example, answering a question. That's something which was extremely difficult to get a machine to do in any way 10 years ago. Google started developing quick answers, and obviously Google search is an extremely popular search engine where you can type in a question and you can usually get a pretty good answer. So simple QA has to a large degree been solved. However, what language models did is they really raised the ceiling in terms of the complexity of a question that you could ask and the response that you could receive from essentially fancy magical rocks. And so it's important to consider the complexity of a task when you are evaluating whether or not to integrate a language model, but it is also important to remember that these have raised the bar. We can do a lot more complex tasks now with language models because they're capable of approximating human reasoning to some degree, at least on a surface level. So, something like designing a jetliner might be a little bit too complicated for an LLM to pull off. And that goes for any sort of complex legal consideration or, writing a scientific paper and performing high-level research. However, if you consider things like surface-level research, Google already has a really useful deep research tool, which deep research might be a little bit misleading because while it's certainly deeper than other research tools with generative language models, it's simply a little bit surface level still. But that is an area where we will probably continue to see serious development. Perplexity is a very popular product and has some very interesting ways of going about things. OpenAI is integrating search features. These kinds of things are certainly within the realm of possibility for a language model to complete. And so when you're evaluating the complexity, consider how many steps it would take to actually complete this task that you want a language model to do. Consider how many different branches it could potentially go down in terms of making decisions. Consider how many different things it needs to know and the level of expertise that it has to have in order to perform it accurately. But remember that there are a lot of things in the range that a language model might be very capable of doing, especially with the right approach to your system design. And the last really crucial metric, I would say, is creativity. When you're evaluating a task or a feature or whatever it may be that you want to allow a language model to do or that you want your language model to automate, it's important to consider how creative of a task it is. Language models are trained on a decent percentage of the text on the internet, and so they're very capable of completing tasks which are within distribution. And the distribution of the internet is very far-reaching. It is very deep, and it is very complex, and it is full of creativity. And so there are a lot of things that a language model is going to be able to do creative-wise because it is trained on creative outputs from real humans doing it, and therefore it can approximate that to some degree. However, for very high levels of creativity, those kinds of things simply will not be within distribution, and so the language model, because it is just a bunch of math, will not be capable of creating novel solutions. Unfortunately, it would seem that language models don't really generalize. They build a relatively surface-level world model, and while they do still build a world model, and they do still create these fascinating statistical relationships between terms and concepts to where they can create extremely useful approximations of language, they are still not necessarily capable of generating novel ideas. So, something like summarizing research findings, if you give the model something to work off of, then it can be really, really positive. And it's also worth considering that a lot of these tasks, you don't want the model to be creative at all. When you have a bunch of research findings, you don't want the model to come up with its own interpretations or come up with its own ideas and then insert those into its output. You want the model to take this big block of text and summarize it for you. You want it to be accurate. And oftentimes there is a trade-off between accuracy and creativity. So something like summarizing research findings, something like scaffolding a project, something like editing language, those are things which are fairly deterministic, fairly stochastic. You're not going to have to worry too much about them being creative, because while taking a selection of text and making it sound Shakespearean is pretty neat, it doesn't require a huge level of creativity. However, something like founding a unicorn startup or having a unique and new philosophical opinion, which is well integrated and cohesive, is going to be very difficult for a language model to pull off. And that's probably not something that you necessarily need it to do. Things like note-taking and brainstorming are a little bit more tricky to quantify in terms of the creativity scale, but I definitely think that those are within the realm of usefulness that language models actually have. So, when you're considering the LLM suitability of a particular task or feature or product, consider the level of creativity required and consider whether or not you would like a language model to do that or whether it would even be capable in the first place. So the general take of evaluating LLM suitability, I would say in a practical sense when you're actually making these decisions, is that this area over here on the high ends of each of these spectra, the LLM isn't going to perform very well. You do not want an LLM making high-level medical decisions. You do not want it making decisions about where to point missiles. You don't want it making decisions about how to drive. And you might not even want it to do your math homework, because it's just not going to be very accurate. When you are considering whether or not the complexity of the task is something that an LLM might be suitable for, it's probably not going to be very good at high complexity tasks. In fact, most humans aren't very good at high complexity tasks. So it's very important to remember that designing a jetliner, and of course these are pretty obvious to these things are pretty obvious to us, but there are a lot of things on this high end or this mid to high end area of the spectrum where an LLM just is going to start having diminishing returns the higher complexity you get. The more steps, the more different divergent branches of solving a task, and the more expensive it's going to become, or the more opportunities for failure that are going to be introduced, and then the requirement of accuracy comes into play, because you end up with a significantly less useful system if the requirement of accuracy is high and the complexity is high. And then when it comes to creativity, it might not be very good at crafting good design. It might not be very good at founding a unicorn startup. It might not be very good at coming up with good business ideas in the first place because it's simply not in distribution. It might be really good as a reflective mechanism off of your ideas. So it might be very good at brainstorming, and that might be it. I'm not saying place artificial limits on what you should and shouldn't do in terms of experimenting with LLM integrations. However, I do think that it's important to have this kind of mindset when going into building with LLMs, because they're going to be very good at the low to mid-level ranges of accuracy, complexity, and creativity. But once you get towards the high level, you're going to start seeing significantly less utility from language model integrations. So, with that said, after we've gone through some of those very practical metrics that you can use to identify and evaluate integration ideas, I just kind of want to go over some general mindset principles that you can use to set yourself up for success in the coming decade. First, it's worth treating models like platforms. These kinds of technologies are novel, and it is important to remember that, because we can be as skeptical as we want. We can say, oh, they're reaching diminishing returns. Oh, look at all of the different problems that they have. Look at all of the tasks that they're bad at. Look at how much they fail at these things that we want them to do. In reality, they are still incredibly useful. And they're useful at a wide distribution of tasks, and they're useful at a wide distribution of outputs. So it's important to treat them like platforms because they provide a foundation upon which you can build really useful things. This means that prompts are actually important, and it's also important to focus on communication. As these models get more refined, as these models are better tuned for human interactions, and as they're more tuned for system integrations, it's going to be very important to focus on the communicative aspect of working with LLMs, because they do approximate language, and that is what they're designed to do. So if you want them to approximate language well, then it's worth making your language good. And so there are plenty of frameworks that you can use to make prompts better. There are online platforms where you can go and get prompts that are pre-made. But it's important to keep prompts in mind as actually very important, because those are the input to a language model. And so if you want the output to be good, then you have to make sure that your prompt and your input is actually good. And while this doesn't necessarily mean that it's an entire job in and of itself, prompt engineering is probably not going to be a job where you just sit and talk to a language model all day. It is a crucial step. It is a crucial skill to have in your tool belt. It is something that you should know how to do. Crafting good prompts is going to give you a lot more performance. Also, use language models for what they're designed for. As I mentioned, they are language approximators. They can produce human-looking language. The outputs look like they were generated by a human. And that's not to say that, they're foolproof or that you can't detect whether or not a language model was used. What I'm saying is that language models are really good at integrating existing language and creating language based on a prompt. So that means that they're capable of generating forms of reasoning based on your prompt, and especially in distribution ones. So you can have a language model which can make decisions, and it can make them accurately, and it can create content, and it can do it well, and it can perform tasks for you. But keep in mind that they are designed for the purpose of approximating human language. And so think about it like it's going to approximate language based on the input, and this kind of goes back to the prompt idea. So use it for what it was designed for, and let it approximate language for you. It's never going to be 100% accurate, and if it was, then it wouldn't actually be useful. You want something which is flexible, but you also want something which is capable of going in a certain direction once you guide it that way. And then lastly, avoid solutions in search of problems. SISPs. We've all heard of them, especially if you're kind of in the wider startup internet where there's a lot of conversation about solutions in search of problems. A lot of startup culture or business more broadly focuses on what problem are you solving. And what you don't want is a solution that you're stuck to. And now, okay, I'm going to go and find somebody who actually wants my solution. What is much better is if you encounter a problem in the wild and you can actually solve it, a problem in search of a solution. So where things can go wrong is you can think like, well, I want to be working on AI and I want to build a cool AI integration and I want to add that to my portfolio, or I want to start a business and I want it to be an AI business. And so then you go around and you start seeing all of these different apps that are being used by people, and you think, what if I made that but with AI in it? It's like, it might be a good idea. I'm not saying that it isn't. However, you aren't actually solving a problem for somebody at that point. You are creating a solution and then hoping that it solves a problem for them. A better approach would be to find problems organically and then maybe consider whether or not a language model would be a good solution or a part of a good solution. And one thing that isn't listed here is that ChatGPT wrappers, so to speak, probably aren't going to be super successful long term. And the reason is that Google is building out Gemini, and it's a chatbot, and it's a suite of tools which is ever expanding in capabilities. And OpenAI is doing the same thing. They're building a suite of tools which is ever expanding in capabilities. And so if you build something which is, over here, and say Gemini's right here, it's the core model, and then your product is over here, so it's unique enough where, you wouldn't expect Gemini to focus on that specifically. Well, as Gemini's capabilities expand, that bubble is eventually going to reach your wrapper, unless your wrapper has a specific value proposition in and of itself. If you take AI out of the equation entirely, is your app still useful? And that's important to consider because you don't know where the bubble of Google's AI product suite is going to stop, and you don't know where it's going to stop for OpenAI either. So it's incredibly important to build solutions to problems that you already see, find problems in search of solutions, and then build those solutions. And if language models make those better, then add language models. The second one is kind of sad for me because I have focused a lot of time and effort into building what I hope to be Jarvis or something like that. But autonomous agents just might not be that good. And this kind of goes back to what we were talking about before with evaluating LLM suitability. As you reach the high end of complexity, as you reach the high end of requirement for accuracy, as you reach the high end of the creativity spectrum, LLMs start to get bad. And what we are asking them to do in being autonomous agents can unfortunately be too much for them. It gets out of distribution really fast. It gets really complex really fast. And if you want these things to actually be useful, then you probably want them to be capable of doing fairly high stakes things. Now, this may not always be true, but if I wanted an LLM to say, oh, you know what, I need this thing for my kitchen. I need a new kitchen organizer. Please go online and buy me a new one. maybe a language model would be capable of doing that. I'm not saying that it's not possible, but if the LLM went online and it started browsing the internet and then it got stuck in some loop and bought, 30,000 kitchen organizers, and now I'm in debt because, obviously there are a lot of safeguards to something like that, but you can imagine things like that actually happening because of some glitch, and assumedly there would be failover mechanisms involved, but that's not always a guarantee, and there will probably be bugs. So if the stakes are really high and autonomous agents just aren't super accurate, then they might not really be useful, because a lot of these tasks that we want autonomous agents to do are going to be high on the requirement of accuracy. They're going to be high creativity. Jarvis, do this really, really complex thing. And I'm not necessarily drawing good examples for what high creativity things that you would want Jarvis to do would be, but you can imagine that they would happen. So, yeah, autonomous agents, they might happen, and I'm not saying that they won't, and I think that they're really fun to play around with, and especially on simple tasks, but the sad truth is that they might not be the best area to focus in, one, if you actually want to build something which is really useful, but also just if you want to build something which is going to make you money. And one of the evidence points for that is that they're just not really being used right now. There are a lot of autonomous agents which claim to be very useful, and they claim to automate entire, professional positions within the workforce. For example, Devin AI. Devin AI is an AI software engineer. It's supposed to replace junior developers to some degree, and they don't want to come out and say that because it generates a lot of negative publicity to say that we're trying to automate software developers. But if you read between the lines, that's exactly their value proposition. Devin AI wants to automate software engineers because software engineers are very expensive to companies. So they put on their website, it's an AI coworker. It can do software engineering for you. You just talk to it and then it'll go out and do it. And maybe it's good at that. I've seen very mixed reviews. I've seen that it's good at some low complexity things. I've seen that it's just really bad across the board. There is a lot of controversy surrounding Devin AI specifically, but I'm just using it as an example of something that it might be used in the early stages, and I can't say with certainty that it won't be used, but I'm not seeing those things actually be useful. I'm not seeing anybody say, hey, please, Devin, go build me this app, and then iterate on it repeatedly, and then have it actually capable of doing that to any substantial degree. I may be wrong, but it is important to remember that when tasks get more complex, which they do really fast in things like software development or anywhere where you're paying a human specifically to do them, LLMs might not be very good at that. They're just not very accurate. They're not good at abstract thinking. They don't generalize. They don't have common sense. There are a lot of fundamental issues that language models have that make them pretty bad for long-term complex reasoning, where you don't want to make mistakes and you want to have something that's really useful and not super buggy and actually works. So you can imagine that they'd be pretty good for low complexity tasks. I think that Home Assistant type programs are going to be really useful. And one space that you might see autonomous agents really good for is sort of low complexity bash scripting style automations. And I think that that's going to be super cool because you don't necessarily need a bash script is fairly deterministic in terms of what you want it to do. You have the constraints defined really well, and you do most of the upfront work, and then you just kind of have this input-output pipeline where maybe an autonomous agent can add a large degree of flexibility to your bash script, but it's still a bash script. It's still a constrained automation. An autonomous agent in and of itself isn't going to be capable of replacing developers or artists or whoever it may be anytime soon, or at least not for high-skilled labor in that sense. And I may be wrong, but I don't think so. Just based on what I've seen, they're not very good. And so, although I really like the idea of it, and I've talked about, simple agent before, and I think that it's a super interesting area to be playing with. And who knows, maybe we'll have some really cool stuff come out in the coming years. I'm talking about the idea of, integrations becoming way better because the underlying platform is already super good. But we'll see. And I would say probably autonomous agents aren't going to be that good. Additionally, the low-hanging fruit is somewhat gone. Google's CEO Sundar Pichai actually said this at, I don't remember what the name of the conference is, but whatever conference it is that the New York Times does, the Deal Book Summit. That's what it is, the Deal Book Summit. Sundar Pichai said at the Deal Book Summit, essentially, that the low-hanging fruit is gone. And so when he looks forward at 2025, progress is going to get a lot harder in the AI space. And it's especially going to get harder for companies like Google or companies like OpenAI, which are trying to reach these very broad consumer audiences and consumer markets. The reason for that is that the low-hanging fruit, things that are just obvious enhancements to existing wide-ranging consumer market-based applications, are pretty much gone. Google's whole workspace suite has Gemini integrated into it. They're building new tools which are Gemini specific, and that's really cool. But Google's whole suite is essentially enhanced with AI at this point. For OpenAI, they're focusing a ton on building out ChatGPT itself. And so the whole idea of, just building a new chatbot isn't going to make you money, because I already plan on using ChatGPT or Gemini if I want a chatbot. So basically, the low-hanging fruit, the easy, broad consumer-based stuff is largely already done. And a lot of those businesses, say Perplexity, for example, are going to face significant challenges because the incumbents, like OpenAI, with much larger user bases, or like Google, which already does search and is the undisputed king of search, are going to just continue developing their products. And even though Perplexity has a really cool value proposition and has made a really cool and useful tool, the people who already use Google, which is the vast majority of people who want to search for anything, are just going to keep using Google, and eventually that Google bubble is going to envelop Perplexity's consumers to a large degree. That's at least a little prediction that I have. And I'm not saying Perplexity will go out of business. They might have some really creative, and I do think that they have some really creative ideas up their sleeves, and so it's very possible, and I'm hopeful that Perplexity and other companies which are focusing on these fairly broad, low-hanging fruit type applications are going to be successful. But even if they are, the likelihood that new businesses are, the likelihood that starting a new startup based on a low-hanging fruit concept is a worthwhile goal, is fairly low. So what does that mean? Does that mean that we shouldn't be focused on AI at all, that we shouldn't be focused in building in this area? I don't think so. I think that we're actually just getting started, and I think that there's actually a huge opportunity for success, and that success is in the niche areas. Building out within a niche has been some of the most standard business advice that I've seen across the internet, and it's good advice. You want to focus on areas where you have a unique set of interests and unique skills, and you are uniquely qualified to address a specific problem in a specific area. And it isn't as broad of an idea. It isn't search but with AI, because search but with AI is very appealing to a broad consumer base, but the incumbents are going to eat all of that up. All of the market share is already gone there. However, if you focus on a really niche area, you focus on a really specific solution to a specific problem, then you're going to get dedicated consumers of your application or your product or whatever it may be who are really interested in what you have to the point where they're willing to pay money to you to build out that thing. And then they're going to tell their friends about it. And that's where you get concepts like product market fit or founder market fit for that matter. Because if your interest and skills align well with this market, then you're going to be able to address it better than any broad scale platform or product or service. So focus on niches, focus on unique, specific areas where you have a specific interest and a specific solution for a specific set of people. And this also goes back to the idea of avoiding solutions in search of problems. You want to find real problems. And a lot of what that comes down to is just kind of paying attention as you're going about your daily life, kind of looking around and noticing when people have complaints about the products that they're using, or they have problems that they just generally encounter in daily life, or where they just could have more optimization in their life, or there could be things where you think that they might be willing to pay for a product because it would just save them time in a specific area. Those kinds of things are going to be hugely successful in the coming decade. And the cool thing about the niche area is that the specific solution space is so much bigger than the broad consumer-based solution space. And you can start in the niche solution space and eventually see your business grow into a broader solution space. And so it's a really cool way, and it's a really important way to be approaching a new technological era, because this is a new platform to build on, but just tackling something like search, but with AI, and it's better than Google in this specific way, probably isn't going to be as deep and as profitable and as useful of a business proposition as a specific area like an assistant application for cooking in the kitchen, or a specific device that you can use for cooking in the kitchen. And that's just a little spitball idea there, but the point is that you want to be applying your skills and you want to be applying your efforts to specific problems that are going to allow you to leverage what makes you special. So, yeah. Now, before we get to that last part, I have just a couple of different points that I want to make about models more broadly and treating them as platforms. Obviously, there's been a lot that we've gone over, but I do want to just kind of summarize and wrap this all up, hopefully in something resembling a neat little bow. So, treat models like platforms. They are designed to take an input and then approximate language. So, they are capable of completing language. They are capable of making a chat experience that feels lifelike. They are capable of, if you give them a reasoning problem, making decisions based on what a human is likely to do. Treat them like platforms that you can build on and use them for what they're designed for. Autonomous agents might not be that good. It sucks, but it's probably true to the degree where focusing your efforts on more specific integrations is probably going to be more useful, because these things are capable of approximating language and therefore applying reasoning to problems automatically without any human in the loop integration whatsoever. However, when you increase the complexity too much, things get out of hand. So, it's probably best to avoid autonomous agents and trying to create the next Jarvis. Maybe Google will do that, but probably not you and I. And it's probably a good idea to use the available APIs to integrate really cool features into applications. Lastly, the low-hanging fruit is largely gone. It's good to focus on a niche that'll allow you to apply your specific skill set and your specific interests and your specific efforts to a specific problem. And it's better to have 100 users, which are very dedicated and very happy with your product, than to have 1,000, which are kind of interested. And so, to conclude, that's a lot of information, but just keep experimenting, have fun, and avoid the fear of missing out. FOMO can be a bit of a powerful motivator in making you consider an area, but it doesn't need to go further than that. It's not going to be the end of the world if you don't build the next incredible AI app. It's not going to be the end of the world if you don't make $1 million in the next 5 years. What is going to be important is that you experimented with the new technology, that you built on top of it, that you built out skills, and that you improved yourself. It's going to be important that you enjoyed your time doing it and you didn't waste a decade. And it's important that you have the right mindset going into it. Think about what's really important to you and how this new technology, which is actually really useful, can help you achieve your own goals and your own path in life. So, yeah. That's everything that I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching till the end if you did. And leave a like below and consider a subscription to the channel if you found this kind of thing useful. Anyway, have a good rest of your day, night, evening, morning, or whatever it may be, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.